Because first we're going to start by creating these variables. We're going to need three variables for three different objects. We have the left paddle, we have the right paddle, and we're going to have a ball. It'll be obvious what these are used for later, but the name should tell you left paddle, right paddle, ball. Then after that, we need to create the speed of the ball. So speed is going to be based on x and y, and it's going to be speed and direction is going to be based off of positive or negative. So we have variable x move, which is our x speed and direction. Then we have variable y move, which is our y speed and direction. Then we're going to have another variable for paddle speed, which is just how fast our paddles are going to move up and down. Then we're going to need to get the height and width of the canvas. For that, we can just create a variable called height, so that you can get height, and create a variable called width, and set it to get width. And then after that, we need two more variables that we can start. We need the player 1 score, which is just the guy on the left. So that equals 0. And we need the player 2 score, which is the guy on the right. Set him to 0, 2 to start. Now we have the function start. And the function start is where our code will begin running. Okay, so for this function, we're going to be just writing out all the functions that we're going to need to run. We know we're going to need to set the background color so we can give it a little bit of style. So let's write that function, set background color. We're going to need to pass a color into it. For now, we'll just pass in blue. Then we're going to need to create the paddles. Then after that, we're going to need a function to create the ball. We're going to need a function to handle any key presses like up or down or W or S so that when somebody presses a key, the paddles actually move. So that's going to be this key down handler right here. And we're going to need one last function, which is going to be a set timer function, which is going to call move ball every 20 milliseconds. Okay, now that we have these functions, let's start by creating the first one. The first function we're going to create is make ball. Make ball, as we know, as the function says, is going to be used to create a ball. So let's just give this a little comment here so that's descriptive. And to make a ball, what we need to do is first we need to create a new circle. And within 15, that just means the circle radius. So we're going to create a circle with a radius of 15. We're going to give that circle a color. For now, we'll just use color white. You can use whatever color. Then we're going to set a position of the ball. We want this ball to be positioned perfectly in the middle. So the way we can do that is we know we have the height of the canvas and we know we have the width of the canvas. So let's just get half of the height and half of the width. And that'll put us exactly in the middle. Okay, now that we have a ball, we need to get the ball's speed and direction because otherwise the ball won't be able to move. So we have an X move and we're going to have a Y move. X move, we're going to use randomizer, which will just give us a random number between 5 and 10. And we're going to have Y move and we're going to do the same thing, get a random number using a randomizer between 5 and 10. And what that X move and Y move means is if it's positive, that means it's going to move that way on the x-axis. If it's negative, it's going to move the opposite way on the x-axis. So we have a is negative function, not a function, but a variable, which we're going to also randomize to allow it to go left or right, depending on just randomly. So if it's negative, then we want it to move left or negative on the x-axis. And if it's positive, we want it to move right or positive on the x-axis. And after all that, we can add the ball. But actually, we don't really need to see the ball move just yet. So let's just add the ball and comment that stuff out for later. And we need to uncomment that function. And now we have a ball. Now that we created the ball, let's move on to our next function. Our next function is going to create the paddles. We're going to call this one make paddles. And inside of here, we're just going to need two rectangles. So the way we create rectangles is first, we're going to use the same concept as before, new rectangle, except instead of a radius, we're going to pass it a width and a height. So for the left rectangle or the left paddle, we're going to say new rectangle, and let's say the width is about 10 and the height is 100. And that's a good size. So same thing we did for the circle, we need to give the paddle a color. We'll give it the same exact color as the ball, which is going to be color dot white. And for the position, we're going to position this left one exactly on the left, which is just on the x-axis is going to be a 0, but on the y-axis, we want it to be about half of the height, but minus or plus the half of the rectangle's height because the rectangle is positioned at its top left point. Then, yep, that looks right. So then after that, we're going to add the left paddle to the canvas and we're going to do the exact same thing for the right paddle. So make right paddle, then we can just copy and paste what we had earlier. And we'll have to change the words from left paddle to right paddle. And then we're also going to need to change the position because we want the right paddle not to be on the left. We want it to be on the right. So to do that, we're going to have to change the X from a 0 to the width of the whole canvas. Since we already have width, we can just type width right here. And actually, because the rectangle has a width of 10, we need to subtract that to get it perfectly positioned. Let's scroll over and now you can see we have two paddles and a ball. Now we have our paddles and we have our ball. The next function we're going to need is our key down handler. And the key down handler does exactly what it says. It handles any key press. And the specific key presses we want to handle are up and down to control the right paddles and W and S to control the left paddles. So we can do, let's say we can do the left paddles first. So just write a little comment here so that we can keep track of what's going on. Handle left paddle up slash down. And then to handle it, we're going to need a simple if else statement. Inside of our first condition, don't forget we need E to get that information about what key was pressed. Inside of our first condition, we're going to say if E.keycode were to equal keyboard.ladder W, just you can probably guess what that means. If they press the letter W, then we want to do something. What do we want to do in that situation? In that situation, we're going to access that left paddle object and we're going to move it up by whatever the paddle speed was. So paddle speed was 50, so we're going to move it up by 50. But remember that in JavaScript, if you want to move up, you need negative y, and if you want to move down, you need positive y. So negative paddle speed moves us up, positive paddle speed moves us down. Same condition, except instead of W is S. And then we want to do the same thing, except instead of negative, we want to go positive. And now let's test this out and see if it works. And it looks like we do have an error in here. And up here, there's an error. We put key code with a K instead of key code with a C. So if you caught that, good job. It's going to take me a little while to catch this, but yep. And there it goes. Key code. Yep, switch that to C, switch the other one to a capital C, and now we should see it working. And we're still making another error. We're not passing a number, so apparently we never gave paddle speed in actual numbers. So let's set paddle speed to equal 50. Paddle speed equals 50. Now let's run it and we should see it move. There you go. Now you can control the left paddle. Now we can just copy that exact same code and use it to control the right paddle, except we're going to need to change left paddle object to the right paddle object, and we're going to need to change our key codes because it's no longer controlled by W and S, it's controlled by up and down. And there's an enum for up and down, so we can just type capital UP and that'll be up, and capital down and that'll be down key. Switch both of those to right, and let's fix that spacing right there and run it. Scroll over a bit so you can see, and boom, we're halfway done. Okay, now we're going to create the background function. So this function is just going to be called set background color, and it's going to do exactly that. It's going to set the background of our canvas. It's going to accept one input, and that input is going to be a color. So we can just say variable background, make it a new rectangle just like everything else, except this rectangle is going to cover the whole canvas. So we can just put width and height because that's the width and height of our canvas. And then we're going to need to give it a color just like in all of our other objects. Well, before that, let's give it a position. Let's say we want to position it as 0, 0. And then we can decide to give it a color. So what color should we use here? We can just, actually, before we give it a color, we don't need to set it at position 0, 0 because by default, its position is 0, 0. So we can just say add background color, and since we already passed in color blue up at the top, that works. And now we're on the final function. For this final function, let's just go ahead and uncomment it. This final function is going to control most of the logic. It's going to control how the ball bounces off the top and bottom walls. It's going to control how the ball bounces off the paddles. It's going to control making the ball move in general. So let's just try to make the ball move first. We're going to call it function move ball. And inside of here, we're just going to say ball dot move. And then we're going to give it how much it should move on the x coordinates, which is going to be x move, and how much it should move on the y coordinates, which is y move. And I forgot to give those a number as well, so let's just scroll up and give those a number real quick. Well, actually, we had the code to give it the numbers. We just need to uncomment it, give it those random numbers. Now we see it move, but it moves off the screen almost immediately. So let's uncomment those to make it move right and left at a randomly. And now we need to make some checks. First thing we need to check for is if it has gone out of bounds or out of play. Well, actually, let's check for if it touched the top or bottom first. So if it bounced off the top wall or if it bounced off the bottom wall, let's create two Boolean expressions for this. First Boolean expression is going to be if ball is touching the top. And the way we know that is if we use ball.get y, which will give us the y position of the ball. And if that's less than or equal to 0, we know that it's all the way at the top of the canvas, or it's gone past the top of the canvas, which means that it's touching the top. And then let's create is ball touching bottom, which is going to be similar, but we're going to say ball.get y is greater than or equal to the bottom of the canvas. And the bottom of the canvas is just going to be the same as the height of the canvas. Then we can just do a check using these two Boolean expressions. We can say if ball is touching top or if the ball is touching the bottom, what do we want to do? We want to make the ball bounce. And the way we make the ball bounce is the same way we made it move. We just do the opposite. Move it the opposite way it was moving before. And we can do that by just saying y move is equal to negative y move. So the exact opposite of whatever y move was before. And we should start to see it bounce. Well, because it's hitting the side, so not the top or the bottom. You see bounce there, but let's just change it to make sure the top and bottom bounce work. So we can remove not the Y move, but if we remove the X movement, it will just only move on the Y axis and bounce directly up and down. And there we go. Now we have a bounce. So let's put our X movement back in there and let's try to move on to the next thing. The next thing we need to handle, obviously, is what if it hits the left wall or the right wall? Well, if it hits one of those walls, we know the game is over. So let's just call this handle game over. We're going to create a few more Boolean expressions. This time is ball touching right wall. We can, instead of checking the ball's y value, let's say ball.getX, which will give us the x position of the ball. And if that is less than or equal to 0, then we know it's touching the right wall. But actually, that's a mistake. It should be if it's greater than or equal to the width. But we'll change that in a second. If it's touching the left wall, that means ball.getX is less than or equal to 0. And yeah, I notice it here. So we're going to switch that to greater than or equal to the width, because the width is going to be the right wall and 0 is going to be the left wall. Now we just do the same thing as before. If is ball touching left wall or is ball touching right wall, and vice versa. We can say reset the ball to the middle of the page because we don't want it to just keep flying all the way off and disappearing. And we want to change the player score because if it touches the left wall, that means the guy on the right scored. If it touched the right wall, the guy on the left scored. So the first thing we do is remove the ball from the canvas. Then we'll add a new ball to the canvas with make ball. And make ball, if we remember correctly, should put the ball directly in the middle again and give it a new speed. Then we can update the player scores. So this one hit the right wall, which means player 1 or the player on the left scored, so add 1 to his score. And then let's print out the scores so that we can keep track. This right here is called string interpolation, but it's just a way to combine strings and variables. So we have player 1 score is the variable player 1 score, and we have player 2 score is the variable player 2 score. So at the beginning of the game, it'll say player 1 0, player 2 0, but as soon as one person scores, the variable updates, and then it will give us the accurate score every time. And then we need to do the same thing in case it's touching the left wall. So else if is ball touching left wall, and we can copy and paste and reuse most of the code that we just used. We could even move this to its own function if we wanted to, but we won't do that just yet. Only thing we need to do is change player 1 score to player 2 score, because if it touched the left wall, that means the guy on the right scored. And we should be able to run this and see that working. So yeah, now we see the scores updating every time it goes out the wall. Okay, but as you can see, if it hits a paddle, nothing happens, which means we need to now handle that. And this is the last piece we need to handle. If it's touching a paddle, then it should bounce off the paddle instead of just going through it and hitting a wall. So same thing we did before, create Boolean expressions is touching right paddle. How do we know if it's touching the right paddle? This one's a little more complicated, so just follow along. We can first check ball.getX, and that gives us our x position again. And if it's greater than or equal to the width of the canvas minus the width of the paddle. If you remember, we gave our paddles a width of 10, so that's why we use 10 here. So the width of the canvas minus the width of the paddle. And then we need to check to make sure it's not above the paddle or below the paddle. So we can say ball.getY, and then we can say if ball.getY is greater than the right paddle, which means it's further down because Y and Y bigger means further down than the top of the paddle, and it's not all the way below the paddle. So we need to also check if ball.getY is less than right paddle.getY plus the height of the paddle. Because of the way rectangles are anchored in canvas, they're anchored on their top left axis. So to get the bottom, we need to add the Y position plus the total height of that paddle, or the total height of that rectangle. And that'll give us the bottom of the rectangle. So that checks, is it touching the right paddle, and if it's not too high and it's not too low. And then the same logic can be used to check if it's touching the left paddle. So we can just change that to is touching left paddle, But instead of with minus 10, we're going to say if it's greater than or equal to 10 itself, because 0 is the left side of the canvas. So we just add 10 to 0, we get 10. And then for the rest of this, it's still going to be the same stuff because they're both positioned exactly the same. So just left paddle, change that to left paddle, and change that to left paddle. And now that should work. Well, the checks will work, but now we need to do something when it's touching those paddles. So if it's touching left paddle or is touching right paddle, what do we want to do? We want it to bounce. So the same concept as before. To make it bounce, we use X move, we need to use the reverse of whatever X move. So if X was 5, we need it to be -5. That way now instead of moving over to the right by 5, it's moving to the left by 5. So we can just say X move equals negative X move. That we should be able to run that and see something actually working. And now if you look at this, we have a fully functioning Pong game. Wait, we have one last error in here. It looks like we misspelled left paddle. Yep. We added 2 T's instead of 1. So let's just fix that quickly. And now we have a working Pong game that you and your friends can play and you can show off to all your classmates. Okay, now that the Pong game is working, there's a couple of things we could do to adjust it if you feel so. You can change the color of the background by just going to wherever you call that function and switching it from color.blue to color.green or red or black or whatever you want to do. You can do the same thing for the paddles and the balls. And if you wanted to change the speed of the game, like let's say you wanted to play on like super fast hard mode, we can just go to where we have the randomizer and change those values because you'll get a random value in between the two. If we double those values, we get double the speed still randomly. And this game is really too hard to even play, but have fun.